Hey guys, Finn here once again, and today we're going to be talking about the importance of choosing and sticking with a genre when you're writing a novel. The single most important thing to keep in mind with any novel is what genre or genres the work is supposed to fit into. Remember that genres can overlap, and you can use multiple genres in writing a novel to give the work just a different overall feel. The reason I rank genre as the most important aspect of noveling is because nearly every aspect of the novel is going to be affected in some way, shape, or form. Be it character names, the scope of it. Is it a galaxy? Is it just a single house? Is it a country? Various little things that are going to change just based on what novel you're using. Alright, so to cover the four major genres, there are there's about four of them. There's actually five. Romance is included, but we're leaving that one out for now. Mostly because you take romance and add it to whatever genre you want. And it's usually a stand-in that you like apply to other genres. All right, so the four major genres under the umbrella of speculative fiction are fantasy, horror, mystery, and science fiction. I'm not going to be covering them specifically in that order, but that's what they are. Okay, so fantasy is a genre that makes the impossible possible. It's typically grounded in the medieval era, but could take place in any time frame ranging from the far-fetched future to contemporary society. Future-based fantasy typically becomes science fantasy, while fantasy that takes place during the contemporary era is often known as urban fantasy. And there's plenty of authors who are writing in urban fantasy right now. Jim Butcher's one of them. There was the guy who made, I believe it was like Percy Shelley or whatever. Um, and there's a lot of them. For futuristic fantasy, for science fantasy, there's actually the Shannara books. Those are considered science fantasy because they actually take place in the future. There's Dune that has a lot of fantastical elements in it, ranging all the way to magic. If you liked not if you were alive during the 90s and you actually watched a lot of television, there was the Babylon series, which was science fantasy as well. So there's quite a bit of it. It isn't that much of a genre in and of itself anymore because people tend to categorize it as science fiction or as fantasy, depending on how much a genre seems to be taking precedence. But it is something that you can still work on, and you can write in that series, and some people will enjoy it, some people will hate it. It's just part of how it works. All right. Science fiction revolves around technology in some major way, and it typically takes place in some sort of futuristic setting that could take place at any time, ranging from the far-fetched past, a la Star Wars, the far-fetched future, a la Star Trek, any time before the current era, a la steampunk, or during the contemporary era and slightly in the future that isn't using esoteric future technology, a la steampunk, well, a la cyberpunk or post-cyberpunk. Science fiction tends to have a degree of unrealistic technology in it that breaks the rules of the universe in some way. The difference being between the difference between this science fiction and science fantasy is that science fantasy tends to have more like wizards and mages or Jedi. That's another one. Star Wars is considered science fantasy because you have the Force and Jedi and stuff. Just keep in mind that when you start bringing in stuff like psionics, you start to blur the line between science fiction and science fantasy. Mostly because psionics are sort of they're they're kind of they get a pass in a lot of ways because people like to believe the idea that you could, in theory, develop a psionic person in reality, but you can't make a wizard in reality. Doesn't really work. Uh, the main difference there being that they can sort of try to explain psionics. You can't really explain magic all that much. Mysteries are an extra one. A mystery can take place during any time period and has a tendency to lean towards being suspenseful. This genre ultimately asks the question, spends the majority of the work answering said question, and then deals with the answer in some fashion that is in line with the protagonist or setting. A well-written mystery novel gives the reader enough information to draw conclusions as to what the novel's answer might be, or what the answer to the question that the novel is posing is, but most importantly, gives enough information for the reader's guess to actually be correct. Well-written mystery and detective fiction is considered mystery. It gives the reader all the information that they need to actually succeed in guessing what the question is. Alright, a mystery novel that revolves around extremely high tension due to the story's question is typically known as suspense. So now we get on to one of my favorite genres, actually. Horror is a relatively special genre when compared to the previous three, as it ends with some sort of bad ending where the protagonist or protagonists ultimately succumb in part or entirely to the horror aspects of the story. Horror typically revolves around isolating the protagonist from external aid, then threatens them in some major way. The usual way this is done is by killing characters. It's just how like movies and TV like to do things, because it's more visual that way. However, you don't have to just flat out murder everybody except for the main protagonist to make a scary story. Alright, so what is important to remember is that the danger the protagonists are dealing with might not reveal itself early or even at all in a way they, and therefore the audience, can comprehend. Plague of Gripes, in his video about horror, described the genre as cerebral. The connotation, I believe, is that horror implies things without directly stating a great deal of its events. The strength of the genre is best found in the conclusions the reader can draw. The reader can find based on the evidence presented to them through the events and things the characters have witnessed. So in that way, it's more similar to mystery than it is to, say, fantasy or science fiction. Because with mystery, you're thinking throughout the entire work and trying to find out, okay, well, what's actually happening here? Who's the bad guy? Yeah, who done it, essentially. With horror, you're thinking about it in a different way for a different reason. Because you want to make sure that you can sort of see any scares coming. You're also always thinking about it, trying to figure out, okay, is this character going to do this? And also, to an extent, putting yourself sometimes in the protagonist's shoes, saying, okay, I wouldn't do that, or I wouldn't do this, and oh no, he's doing that. Oh no, what's going to happen? So, really, that's why one of the reasons it's a cerebral genre. So the great mark of a great horror writer is the ability to invoke a sense of anxiety, unease, and fear within the reader's own mind, with the reader's own mind doing the majority of the work for the story. Such horror builds tension in such a way that it's easy for the reader to start building tension in his or her own head just by thinking about the story's events or implications. Horror where the ending is happy can usually be categorized as dark fantasy instead of horror, which merges fantasy and horror genres to allow for an ending where the malevolent forces in the novel ultimately lose. Horror that takes place in space is typically known as space horror, mostly because you can't actually go anywhere in space. The reality of space horror is that if your ship off of this thing gets blown up or disabled, you basically have to find another way off the ship, and there might actually not be one, short of just fixing the ship and flying it home, or to somewhere else. You literally end up with a point to where you have nowhere else to go except this ship. And if you try to block yourself in somewhere, you're probably going to get killed eventually. If you hide, you'll lose. If you face it directly, it'll probably overwhelm and kill you anyway. So with space horror, you're stuck with this idea of, I need to circumvent the really dangerous stuff deal with the things that aren't quite as dangerous while coming to the reality that no one's gonna help me. I'm on my own entirely. And that's the scary part of space horror. With terrestrial horror that take terrestrial meaning on a planet, or horror on where you can get into like an escape pod and get out of there, you can at least go and eventually maybe find help. But in space horror, depending on what level of technology we're dealing with, it could take people months, if not years, to get to you. And really, that's sort of the other part of space horror, but also that sort of bleeds into science fiction as well. Of if something goes wrong, you might be able to defeat whatever it was that wanted to kill you, or that was dangerous to you, but you might die far before anybody can help you. And that's just a reality of anything taking place in space, or, leagues under the ocean. It's just a reality. Alright. So as stated there earlier, genre is the most important aspect for the writer, but it's also what tells the reader what to expect on some level. Screwing the reader's expectations can pay off, but it is imperative that you uphold just as many expectations as you defy. It's easy to turn off editors and readers if your novel's genre suddenly changes without alluding to the presence of the second or third genre throughout the work. The twist that the main protagonist's love interest is actually a Lovecraftian abomination can be interesting, but if the story lacks such horrific events up until that very specific point in the story, your reader's most likely going to put down your book after frowning at the page with a raised eyebrow, just like, what the fuck is this? Like, who'd write this? They're also going to ask themselves, alright, so reading this story, it's whatever, it's okay, I guess, and then the last, okay, so we have 50 pages to go, okay, blah blah blah, and then her head twists and contorts into a strange angle, and her head starts to pop off as tentacles writhe out of her neck, and it's just like, where the hell did this come from? So avoid doing that. There's a difference between shocking your reader and your reader just sitting there like, what? So keep that in mind. Avoid those moments. You want the what the fuck moment, but you don't want the what the fuck moment. You want the moment where your readers are like, whoa, holy crap. But you don't want them to just be like, well, what? Alright. You should make it a point to build your novel's genre to already include these aspects of whatever genre you intend to use from the very start. This ensures that your readers can see elements of the hidden genre coming, but it also ensures aspects of the hidden genre exist throughout the entire novel. This is actually direly important. You need to make sure that whatever genres you're going to use, you mix them together from the very start. Because this means that regardless of what your story is, you're going to have elements of all of the genres that you're employing throughout the entire work. Therefore, relatively smart readers are going to be able to look and sort of figure out what's going on. So at the end of the day, if the reader's paying attention, he or she will have a moment of clarity where the secondary or tertiary genres become apparent, applying the hints to their existence in a sudden realization or aha moment. This also allows perceptive readers to predict something before encountering it, which is bound to make them feel particularly intelligent. Remember, anything that's sort of hiding information from the reader, you want your reader to be able to figure it out so that they feel smart. You don't want them to, because the difference between them looking at something and wondering where the hell that came from, and them looking at something and nodding and going, yeah, I saw that coming, is the hints that you're giving them. Is the existence of that genre within the work as a whole. So just make sure that you mix these genres together properly, and then basically give an even spread of everything. if you're writing a dark fantasy story, but you have some science fiction in there. Cool. Well, we know it's dark fantasy. We know that you want to employ some science fiction. So the only thing you need to do is really play up the fantasy and the horror aspects, with having the science fiction aspects sort of in the background, so really subdued until they start to become more and more apparent. A book that did this fairly well was Prince of Thorns, King of Thorns, and Emperor of Thorns. It was called the Broken Empire trilogy. It did this fairly well. It's categorized as dark fantasy, but it has some sci-fi aspects in it. I won't go into exactly what those aspects are, but they exist. Alright. In the end, genre is going to define both large parts of any novel and reader expectations. It will define what kind of setting the story takes place in, and the types of heroes you can use, the overall tone of the work, and ultimately the story you tell. You can screw with the genre by telling stories that seemingly defy conventions, and many subgenres have been born through this process. But it's a tricky line to walk at times. Remember that genre, like all categories and formulae, exists to help you write the novel. To that end, you should attempt to take whatever aid you can get, since writing is ultimately one of the most difficult things a person can do. The author reaches for the stars, and through an effort of creativity and willpower, creates something that seemingly comes out of nowhere. It's just the reality of how writing works. Alright guys, that's pretty much all that I have for this vlog. So if you enjoyed the vlog, like, subscribe, do whatever you like. Up to you. And I will see you guys next time on the next video. Bye bye.